Welcome everyone to the Ask an Architect show. Here with me today, Patricia Andrasik. Patricia, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Patricia has a very colorful background, a lot of different angles that I'd really like to dive in, because I think, Patricia, you have some very specific and practical knowledge to distribute to our students, so I want to get into it. But real quick, kind of a 15, 20-second update overview. Who are you and what are you doing right now?
Wow. Well, right now I'm a professor at the Catholic University of America. I practice still, and I've used that practice as a research venue so I can incorporate students into the research practice while they're getting AXP credits.
I think that the research angle of your work is clearly where we want to probably spend most of our time. But let's go all the way back, because early on in your career, you started out as a Fulbright scholar in Slovakia. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that experience. How did you get there? What was it all about? What was it like?
Well, I've always been interested. I'm, I guess, the oddball of my class in school that spent every spring break and summer in Habitat for Humanity. So when I finished school, went on to grad school, I started to realize that I had a strong proclivity towards transitional housing facilities, helping people through architecture. So what I ended up doing is worked for Habitat for Humanity during these summers as a volunteer, and then quit a job here at NASA doing space planning to go across to go across the country to volunteer for an architect designing transitional facilities, transitional homeless facilities, and from there couldn't make a lot of money doing that, obviously. So went back to the professional world, and I was fortunate enough to have a Fulbright scholarship. I went back to Bratislava. Finished my technical training in grad school there, and from there I came back here and started to teach. People assumed that I would be a professor and I would get my PhD and I would quit architecture per se and only teach, and I actually disagree with professors not having practical experience, because there's no book can teach you what it feels like to make a mistake on a rooftop when you're specifying the wrong EPDM, for example, and you have to sketch out the right solution. Yeah. So I continued practice. I obtained my license, and I was teaching at the same time, simultaneously, studios, and only 4 or 5 years ago I jumped into academia full time. Okay.
So you've always kind of kept a nice balance between research and practice.
Yes.
And I think that's a really practical piece of knowledge you just dropped there, that if you're interested in that research pathway, or PhD potentially, that doesn't mean that you have to step away from practice.
Definitely.
It's almost, you would say, it sounds like you're encouraging folks to stay very connected to practice.
Absolutely. I think about 80% of our students at the Catholic University of America are interested in practicing architecture. Most of those 80% are also interested in architectural research. Sure. And absolutely you can do both. It's a misnomer to think that you could only fall into one or the other. You can do both.
It's almost two arms of the same body, the body being a profession. So Patricia, tell me about your research. I think it sounds like you've dived into a bunch of different topics and angles to your research, but give me kind of the highlights of maybe 2 or 3 of the most significant or interesting topics, projects, angles you've looked at over the last few years.
Sure. So my main research focus is building performance analytics. Getting into the pre-design, the analytics before energy modeling. That doesn't include energy modeling. I'm not an engineer.
So this is pre-energy modeling.
This is pre-energy modeling. Understanding solar incident radiation, percentage on a facade, for example, mitigating that heat gain through solar shading, very much what you would learn in Enviro 1, but using new software such as IISVE, some of the Autodesk Revit apps that we can find now, some of the plugins. And Autodesk especially, and other software companies such as Serfass are advancing pre-design tools to such an extent that all architects should be using them in their design process, but not all of them are. So I'm trying to encourage that through my research and my students' understanding of architecture.
Would you say that a lot of research is getting to or collecting data that doesn't isn't highlighted, isn't pronounced, isn't distributed well. I mean, it sounds like a lot of research projects are about collecting or acquiring data that's hard to get. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it is accurate. I think the tools, people don't know how to use some of the tools. I think the processes, however, is the most important aspect of this pre-design, of this building performance analytics that people don't understand. If they need to, they use one tool for solar shading, but they don't understand the impacts of the artificial lighting in the space.
Sure.
So they solve one without getting to the other. So I've developed a little bit of a research methodology that goes through the steps of this iterative building performance analytics project. But the unique part is that I don't choose to use that on office buildings or traditional architecture.
Okay.
I choose to use that in more social justice projects. For example, I'm designing refugee housing now in northern Iraq.
Okay.
I have a couple of students working with me on that project. So I'm using a very, very technical, potentially new process in architecture and almost democratizing it for the people who don't typically have an opportunity to benefit from that in their net zero design.
So I think you mentioned the term social justice, and that being kind of a perspective or an angle that you were really passionate about. Define that a little bit further for me, because I think that a lot of our students are very oriented towards design that impacts the community, design that impacts the world, and there's a little bit of a philanthropic philosophy in our students these days. So what does social justice within the terms of design mean to you? I mean, what is that?
Yeah, it mainly means equity in design.
Okay.
So that, not necessarily equality, but equity.
Okay.
So giving people what they deserve, what they need, what they're entitled to, basically. For example, my example that I just mentioned, designing net zero refugee housing is something that you don't usually see. Seeing net zero office buildings is something that we do see frequently. So giving an opportunity for people who don't usually have an opportunity to partake in good design strategies and solid design.
Got it. So
In a nutshell.
You're applying some principles of sometimes higher end design or more significant design types like a commercial office building to populations that don't always receive that type of design benefit. So translate that for me. How do those types of design elements actually benefit those audiences? What are you doing with that Iraqi project that where net zero makes a difference?
Well, in northern Iraq, the climate is very unique because people presume that you're in the Middle East, you're going to be hot all the time. It's a desert climate. It's actually not. And going through Climate Consultant and understanding, looking at the correct TMI files as an input for building performance analytics, we recognize that there are really, really cold winters. So you're not just dealing with a tent that'll suffice for a refugee family for the entire year. You actually need insulation in that tent. You need to have substantial building products. So with that, you also need to understand what is going to minimize any type of artificial HVAC or any mechanical systems that they don't have.
Gotcha.
They're off the grid most of the time, so you have to design net zero for that. It seems very logical to us, but a lot of the architectural firms, even people who are contractors who may be there attempting design, are not familiar with the terms. They're not familiar with correct processes towards the net zero design, so they don't use it. So you end up seeing some of these units with jerry-rigged grid systems where you see wires coming from some of the electrical infrastructure there, or you see single AC units per container.
I love
that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that you're mapping out the in the weeds practical applications here, because I think sometimes that gets missed and that people don't always apply great building design and building standards to some of these underserved populations. So I think it's really unique. Patricia, what about your students? You work very closely with students year in and year out at Catholic University, and they're integrated into a lot of your research projects.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the things that you've seen, some of the research projects that you've seen students actually get into that have really been innovative or interesting, or that maybe you've taken on and tried to further yourself? What are students doing right now that you found interesting?
So we just finished a project in Southeast DC.
Okay.
And it was through a developer grant, meaning that we work with developers and with clients downtown as a regular architectural firm would.
Okay.
They give the university money, the university takes a cut of it, but we pay our students through that research grant. And the students are interns basically in my firm as a researcher. Mm-hmm. One of the most interesting projects that we just finished was a container housing unit in this district of Washington, D.C. The developer approached us, very, very small footprint, was wanting not necessarily affordable container housing. He wanted to pierce the market, expand the demographics in that specific area. It was a lower income area. And my research assistant and myself, mainly my research assistant, went to a lot of meetings with him, and we I think persuaded him to open up the market to more affordable housing. So we designed a pretty interesting complex there. We had a total of 12 units at the culmination, but not as a mass housing unit would seem. We have vagaries in the circulation, we have green roof, we have cisterns, we have intensified ventilation, because we've studied this through building performance analytics. We're finished with the project, we're waiting for the next step, we're waiting for an investor, we're waiting for the developer to find an investor for us, and then we go into DDs and CDs. But my student is Dan Ruck is the one who was my student at that time. Mm-hmm. I'm working with 3 other students on another grant that we received. So the students are really, and I want this, the students are the ones who propel the research and propel the design. I'm just the boss, I'm just the licensed architect who's overseeing, and if they go too far off, then we kind of corral them back.
It seems like a great way for students to actually get real-world practical experience in a context of an academic setting at the same time.
That's what I've tried to do the past few years.
Sounds like a smart thing to do. Patricia, one thing you mentioned to me is that you have these research projects happening, but you also couple them with your own personal design firm or design corporation. So how does that work? How do you manage that? What's the process for that? How does something go from being an academic research project to Patricia Andrasik, architectural design?
Very carefully and very legally.
Right. Carefully. Yeah. I'm sure there's some weeds to get into here.
So the research project is funded, like I mentioned, through a donor or through a contractor or through a developer. To the university. The university is the recipient of that funding. The research assistant, not necessarily me, but the research assistants are the recipients of that funding through the university after the university takes a cut. We design up to schematic design, where we go through codes, we have a set of drawings that consists of a section, the building performance analytics, the floor plan, perspective drawings, visual drawings. And then after that, usually the developers or the clients pursue investors for the project, like I mentioned with this last one. After that, if there's construction documents that they choose us to continue, that's a separate contract. That's a separate legal platform.
Gotcha.
Because there's more liability to the construction documents than there are for the schematic design. So the students usually stop at that point because they go on to their careers, they graduate.
Makes sense. Yep.
And then I take on the projects from there, either get other students, but I do it off the side. So I have my own insurance for that.
So it's wholly and independently separate. And
yes.
I wanted to get that out there because I think that colors a really good opportunity for our folks who are interested in teaching. We started off by saying you should be in practice and teaching. Well, this kind of showcases how to do it. Patricia, a couple other things I want to touch on with you. I want to give some advice to our students, but first, before I do, I kind of wanted for them to get to know you a little bit so they know where the advice is coming from. Tell me a little bit about what Patricia Andrasik does outside of research and architecture. Do you have a hobby? Are you reading something right now that's interesting? Do you watch a certain show? Like, what's interesting to you? What do you do for fun?
Well, my husband and I don't have TV intentionally.
That might be a whole nother podcast.
We've because of the teaching and the sustainability that I teach, I can't live my life differently than how I teach it, because I wouldn't be able to ethically teach what I do.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
my husband and I, we have a very low carbon footprint. We have rags instead of paper towels. We unplug all of our vampire loads at the end of the night. Our electricity bill is $25.
Wow.
We very much strive, and he's not an architect.
I was going to ask.
No.
Yeah, that was the next logical
He
question.
actually teaches political theory at George Washington and at Catholic, but we have the same philosophies on low carbon footprint, because neither of us would be able to teach what we teach unless we practiced what we did also. On the side, I love rollerblading. That's kind of an anomaly, but
well, yeah. I mean, that's human powered, effort there, human powered travel. But I mean, what I love about that, before we get into the advice section, is that you're essentially, walking the walk. Or walking the talk, or whatever you want to say. What you're preaching on campus is what you're living in real life, and I love how you're not only combining academia with practice, you're blending it all. So I think it's the perfect combination of all those things. So to wrap it up, Patricia, we have mostly college students, a lot who are kind of entering their last year of school, maybe approaching graduation in May. So they're on the doorstep of the profession.
Yep.
What advice would you give to those folks, whether it be career or what to do next, or just life advice? What would you say to somebody who is in their last year of school right now?
Gosh, I would tell you the same thing I would tell my students that I have now at different levels. Embrace your passion. You obviously love architecture, which is why you're spending all-nighters in the studio, but embrace the passion that led you to architecture. And this may sound cliche, but don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it. You're not strong in math. That's okay. Take some extra classes. Get to that point. You're worried about taking the ARE. We've all done it. We all didn't think we would do it, but we did it. Embrace that passion that led you to the career. Pursue that passion regardless of the method that you pursue it. If you have to get one of your professors off to the side and say, can I work with you on a project? Can we do something together? Do that. They probably will say yes. They're usually not approached by students asking them to do research. Yep. So that's what my advice would be. Just continue, persevere, embrace your passions, and don't be afraid to ask your mentors for direction or even to embark on another project.
I think that's great advice, Patricia. And for those who maybe this is their first episode watching, I hope that this show showcases that there are so many different types of passions within architecture that you can pursue, yourself included, Patricia. I mean, you've definitely had certain periods of your career where you pursued a certain angle or a certain topic or a certain passion. And there's so many of those. So if you haven't seen the other episodes, please check them out, because there's lots of people out there with lots of passions in architecture. Patricia, thank you again for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much.
We could probably talk for another 60 minutes. I think there's enough content here. But we'll stop for today, and we'll see you next time on the Ask an Architect Show.